So we're talking about poor Black and brown kids growing up in neighborhoods without access to resources and services. We had a criminal legal system that was one-sided. Every time someone is shot or killed, they focus all of their efforts on apprehending the perpetrator. However, there was no deployment of therapists and healers and counselors to deal with the ripple effect of trauma in the community as a result of somebody being harmed.
That's Aqeela Sherrills, reflecting on the challenges and systemic issues that amplified gang violence in Watts, LA throughout the 1980s. Aqeela is a seasoned activist with over 3 decades of dedication to community safety and healing from violence in underserved areas. In 1992, he brokered a historic peace agreement between the rival gangs, the Bloods and the Crips. He's a nationally acknowledged expert in victim services and community-driven public safety. Aqeela co-founded the community-based Public Safety Collective and spearheaded the Newark Community Street Team initiative. Under his leadership, Newark saw a significant drop in its homicide rate from 2015 to 2019. Beyond his on-ground efforts, Aqeela has advised the International Association of Chiefs of Police and is renowned for his expertise in gang violence intervention, restorative justice, and trauma healing. He's also a skilled facilitator, life coach, and mediator. I'm your host, Warren Hoffman, and in this episode of Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, Aqeela takes us on a journey into the heart of community violence. You can feel his passion as he recounts growing up amidst the turbulent backdrop of the 1980s in South Los Angeles, the profound impact it had on him, and his relentless drive to intervene and prevent further community violence. Aqeela has been a trailblazer in this arena for decades, and he shares invaluable insights on effective strategies and the necessary shifts needed to reshape the narrative surrounding community violence.
This is Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, podcast of the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation.
Hi, Aqeela. Thanks a lot for joining me.
Hey, Warren, thanks so much for the invitation.
You have an impressive track record of working to reduce and prevent community violence. One particularly notable accomplishment among many is the facilitating of the peace agreement between the Bloods and Crips, which I'd like to talk about, including your other initiatives, but I'm hoping you can set the stage for us. And can you take us back to your youth and talk about maybe where you grew up, your upbringing, and perhaps any sort of early life experiences that sort of shaped your perspectives on community violence?
Yeah. Interestingly, I grew up, in Watts in South Los Angeles. Watts it's well known for the 1965 rebellion that dominoed to multiple cities across the country, in which Black Americans just refused to be seen as second-class citizens and relegated to a particular place with redlining and all of those things, right? And so just the history of Watts and this activism, I feel like is in my blood, right? Watts has the largest concentration of public housing west of the Mississippi. 4 major housing developments in a 2.2 square mile radius area. Railroad tracks separate kind of like the east side and the west side of Watts. And since the late 70s, it's been ground zero for the war in Los Angeles. And what many social justice activists call the longest running war in the history of the US, just urban street gang wars. In LA County alone, between 1983 and 2003, there were over 20,000 gang-related deaths. It didn't include those permanently maimed or incarcerated for the rest of their life behind their participation. So, growing up in Watts in the projects, man, I witnessed things that no child should ever be subject to. I lost friends and family. I'm old enough to witness the crack cocaine trade, war in the neighborhood, man, that displaced families and just uprooted an entire community. And then the narrative that kind of grew out of this war on drugs was the emergence of gangs, right? These super predators that was being communicated by some, politicians in the system. They created this label, gangs, that dehumanized the people behind it and desensitized the public to our cry for help, right? The first 3 stories on the news was about some violent act, and the way that even the news would portray the violence happening in the community. They'd say on Central and 103rd, 3 gang members were shot and killed. engaged in an interesting battle, and people will be like, get them off the streets, lock them animals up, get rid of them. But you see, if the media really characterized the story properly and said that 3 14-year-old kids were shot and killed on Central and 103rd, it would have been a totally different response. But because they utilized the label gangs, it dehumanized the people and desensitized the public.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't considered that the label of gangs, as reported in the media, having that effect of desensitizing the public and dehumanizing the victims. So sort of a common pattern seen in most violent conflicts between groups, whether it's done by the media or even purposely by one of the parties at times. Now, how about yourself growing up in this area? Can you tell us more about that?
I'm the youngest of my mom's, of Miss YG's 10 kids. We grew up in the projects. We was attracting kids that people talked about, because what we didn't have materially, we made up with our imagination. And Warren, I want to, say this story real quick, because this is the foundation, I would say, of my life's work in terms of working to end community violence, and to build comprehensive strategies that can be adopted by our larger public safety system, right? As I said, the youngest of 10 kids, and we didn't have nothing. The youngest 5 brothers and sisters, we used to get in the room and we used to, like every day, and we used to talk about this thing we called the story, right? And the story was about how we would be walking down the street and we fall into this fissure, in this hole, and this Chinese master was waiting there for us and said that, hey, you guys are the chosen one. He blessed us with special powers and gifts. And my sister Londi, she would tell the best stories. So she would assign each one of us powers, and then we would talk about the story for hours. We told the story so much as kids, it became our mantra. I believe that I would grow up and do something great one day, that we would change the world. And so anytime I got in trouble or had some type of real, challenge, I always reflected back on the story. So my transformative moment, came when I went to college in 1987. My sister Londi was the first in our family to graduate from a 4-year university. She was my inspiration for wanting to go to school. This was 1987. It was the height of the war in LA. We're talking about 1,100 murders in the city, 1,500 in the county. My brother got shot. All of my partners got shot. 1989, I lost 13 dudes that I grew up with my entire life, murdered, right? I mean, it was horrific. And I was in college hiding on campus. And there I had a transformative experience. I met a woman always changes your life, brothers and sisters, listen to this, who has the capacity to love you unconditionally. She saw me in a way that I couldn't see myself. And I shared with this woman my deepest secret and shame, which was that I was sexually abused as a kid. Now, I remember speaking those words out of my mouth. And I was totally shocked, because I promised myself I would never tell anyone what happened to me. The same symptoms that are associated with sexual abuse, being emotionally desensitized, trust issues, imaginings and flashbacks, are the same, symptoms that are associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And so there's a correlation. I realized that as she asked me who, what, when, and why, and where, and I was just totally shocked. I realized I never questioned the violence that I witnessed in the neighborhood. And I've seen people shot point blank in the face. I've witnessed my partners get cut in half with an AK-47. Like I've seen things and witnessed things, right? I never questioned the violence, because ultimately it meant to question the violence that I experienced in my own house. And I didn't have language for it. I didn't have the courage to confront the perpetrator, of that violence. But I was fortunate that I had, individuals in my life, Professor Scott, who transitioned earlier this year at Cal State Northridge, who was a real inspiration for me, made me read the autobiography of Malcolm X, The Evidence of Things Not Seen by James Baldwin. It politicized me and it gave me courage and language. And it was transformative. And so when I went back to the neighborhood and saw that the war was still going on, I had a level of consciousness, all of a sudden. Now that I did this research, and I started asking the question amongst the homies in the neighborhood, like, who was winning the war that we was waging against each other? Every time somebody died in the neighborhood, we pour out a little, drink as libation, in their memory. We'd even hit their name up on the wall, to memorialize our loved ones gone. But there was nobody there to provide direction and guidance for the children that got left behind. And so we were like, hey, what are we going to do? So we started proposing the idea of having a peace treaty, and Katz was like, man, are you insane? You know, do you know how many bodies have been traded between our folks? But I would say that we were divinely inspired in terms of the vision that Spirit actually gave us to pull together the 4 major housing projects as a part of a larger strategy to bring an end to violence in the city. But it was Minister Farrakhan, respectfully, with the Stop the Killing tour. I mean, the nation was the vanguard of the Black community then. He came to LA in 1989, November, brought gang members from all across the city. We took 25 of our homies from Grape Street to go hear the message. There was another 1,500 gang members there. There was a note passed around that there would be a meeting at Jim Brown's house, because we were already heavily engaged in the violence ending strategy in the neighborhood. And so Minister Farrakhan, created the forum for us to have the conversation. And then Jim Brown utilized his celebrity and his fame to create consistent dialogue, and then leverage his own capital to fund what we then launched was American, a 15-chapter self-esteem life skills curriculum, which was basically a short course in human development that came the foundation of the peace treaty.
Before we get to the peace treaty, I was hoping you could talk a bit more about the parties, that the gangs, for lack of a better word, the groups of youth that are fighting each other. So for those that aren't familiar with the Bloods and Crips, can you shed some light on their general dynamics?
Yeah, so let me say a little bit about gangs, and especially about Black American gangs, because Black American gangs are different from Latino gangs and from Asian gangs. It's a cultural dynamic, right? So Black American gangs are decentralized and fractured. They were created as surrogate families because people lost their nuclear family to the real killer, which is poverty, which is organized. In the capitalist system, somebody has to be poor in order for somebody to be rich. People lost their nuclear family to trauma and to violence. And so, especially coming out of the 60s movement and the Black Panther Party, where there was a real fight for self-determination. In the 70s, our community was flooded with PCP and drugs. And then they followed that up with crack cocaine, and we discovered, that the Reagan administration was involved with, the CIA. We have a whole show that's dedicated to it, Snowfall. The character in that movie, in the movie Snowfall, Freeway Rick, it's my partner. We all grew up together. You know what I'm saying? Like he was selling drugs for the CIA and didn't know it. So we're talking about poor Black and brown kids growing up in neighborhoods without access to resources and services. We had a criminal legal system that was one-sided. Every time someone is shot or killed, they focus all of their efforts on apprehending the perpetrator. However, there was no deployment of therapists and healers and counselors to deal with the ripple effect of trauma in the community as a result of somebody being harmed, right? And to a great extent, because of the systemic racism and implicit biases that exist in policing, there was no real urgency in terms of apprehending perpetrators. So when you look at the clearance rate, around homicides in a city like LA between like in the 80s and in the 90s, I mean, it was probably in the single digits in terms of homicides. You know what I'm saying? I mean, in the single digits in terms of non-fatals, and then in the low double digits in terms of homicides, right? And so, about 15 years ago, a prominent civil rights attorney in LA named Connie Rice did a call to action report for the city, in which she basically discovered that less than 3 to 5% of so-called gang members were actually committing homicide and murder. Now, you would think because of the way the media was characterizing, the violence that happened in the city, that, it was pervasive and everybody was involved. And I would tell folks, hey, I'm from Grape Street, the neighborhood that I live in, to Jordan Housing Projects. I can count the shooters on one hand. And I'm like, and those individuals have serious mental health issues that went unaddressed their entire life, whether they was incarcerated or out. So we're talking about a system that has neglected a people and undermined the development. And then with the label gang, they added up, because when they said gang, people start thinking mafia. It created an image in people's imagination about what this culture was. Like we were centralized and organized and had treasuries and armories. Like, I literally had a cop tell me that before, right? And I said, my man, that is so far from the truth. I'm like, hey, most of the conflicts that happen in the neighborhood between so-called gangs, are over women and money. They have nothing to do with gangs at all. Many of the individuals had to turn to the underground economy and to the Black market, because we have a system that says that creates a social policy that even if you go to jail, you commit a crime, you pay your time. I mean, you do your time, you come home, you get penalized for the rest of your life. In the state of California, if you got a felony conviction, there were 4,800 restrictions that prevented you from accessing housing, loans for school, all these things. 73% of them were lifetime restrictions. Okay, so here's the type of environment that you have Black and brown youth and young adults existing in. And every time, we cry out for help in terms of needing resources, trauma recovery centers, after school programs and services, alternative healing and recovery, strategies, what we got was law enforcement. More and more police to police the neighborhood, and and folks didn't even look at the collateral impact that it was having on the city in terms of taxpayers. In the 80s and 90s, man, we were being sued so much. I mean, $300-400 million a year in terms of lawsuits against law enforcement, right? For excessive force issues and everything. Folks, because we were Black and brown, we were denied access to services and healing support. We were criminalized. And this is a reality. This happened in every major city across the country. And to this day, my man, the number one cause of death of Black males between 14 and 25 is gun violence. Only recently in the past 2 years, the Biden administration, probably more than any other sitting president in the history of this country, has invested real money in comprehensive strategies and solutions that's not just policing. Police is an important part of the public safety ecosystem, but police as a single ubiquitous institution that's responsible for safety in our community, with all of its history of racism and implicit biases, is a false narrative. We have to have a balanced system. We have to invest in Pookie, Raheem, and Sabrina and them, those folks who are on the front line in those neighborhoods, through a public health frame to be able to address violence, much like they did with malaria in Africa, right? The public health frame says that those who are closest in proximity to the violence have to be equipped with the skills, the tools, and the resources to do the intervention, the prevention, and the treatment. Nobody's going to have more intelligence than Bow Wow in Jordan Downs, right? In terms of what's happening on the ground. Ain't nobody gonna have more intelligence than Drac. These are individuals in the neighborhood who grew up in the element. They made some mistakes, paid their debt to society, and now they're in the neighborhood giving their entire life to creating safety and peace and preventing retaliatory violence. And they're leveraging their relation capital to do that. We need to pay them, and we need to pay them well, because this work is extremely dangerous. And so as we pay cops, as public safety professionals to intervene in high-risk situations, we must do the same thing with community violence intervention practitioners, or what we call community-based public safety practitioners in the field.
Yeah, I can imagine it's very dangerous work, and I can understand how there can be no one else better suited for that work, leveraging their human capital, I think, as you put it. So I'd hope they'd get compensated appropriately as well. I want to back you up for a moment.
Yes, sir.
It sounded like a very pivotal moment was with Minister Farrakhan for the Stop the Killing tour. Mm-hmm. And you also highlighted the state of the situation. How was that received then? I'm just wondering, like, in terms of the idea of ripeness and, were people receptive to the idea of peace and getting along?
Not.
Absolutely not. Can you speak about how that was received and, why maybe he thought it was a good idea? Or...
Well, again, the peace treaty was divinely inspired. And I say that, Spirit gave us a vision. I mean, we were already engaged in stopping the killing, but in terms of the strategy, right, on how to create a domino effect around peace in the neighborhood and in the city, we got a vision for it, right? And so essentially, here was the strategy. We, when you take red and blue and you combine them as a color, what do you get?
Purple.
Okay. So Grape Street, their color is purple. And so we started out marching in all of the housing projects and in our enemy territory, basically in red, black, and green, because we know that brothers respect their strength, asking them about what do they think about, a peace treaty, to end the war that was happening between folks. And so we were doing this like every weekend, 25 deep, marching in the housing projects. We would have the new African flag, the red, black, and green flag, and we'd come marching down the street. And we'd be saying things like, I don't know what I've been told. African people are mighty bold, done destroyed the old plantation. Now we're going to build a new Black nation, Black power. And then it's a call and response. Black power, getting stronger by the hour, getting stronger by the hour. So people would see us coming down the street in their neighborhood with all of these former gang members, in uniform, and they would be like, yo, and then they'd recognize somebody and they like, yo, what y'all doing? And so, but we would go to the places, the key places in neighborhoods where they was gambling, because that's where a lot of the gangsters was at, right? And so that's where the conversation started. I would literally stand on a crate and the brothers would surround me and I would start, as we call it, dropping knowledge, right? And so the thing that we inspired the homies from Grape Street to make the first move, because, cats was like, why the Nickersons can't make the first move? This is a big blood neighborhood in Watts. And we were like, well, when you combine red and blue, what color do you get? Purple. We was like, purple is the color of honor and valor and leadership. We was like, we were like, we're Grape Street, right? Grape Street is all of the individual grapes on the vine that connects everybody together. We was like brothers. And then also, if you look at Watts is in a square. The four major housing projects are on an angle, right? On a 90-degree angle. The hypotenuse runs from Nickerson Garden to Jordan Downs, right? And so these are the esoterics also that we introduced into this whole conversation, right? Because our whole thing was that, hey, if we connect the hypotenuse, this is the line to God. If we connect Nickerson Garden and Jordan Downs, we would create a domino. These are the two biggest Crip and blood neighborhoods in the city. We would create a domino effect for peace across the country. And so that's the conversation that we started engaging. Jim Brown utilized his celebrity and his money to finance the movement. He created his house became a meeting place for us to have dialogue and conversation, and people had hope because, hey, we had Jim Brown came to our hood day, right? So another phenomenon that happens amongst urban street gangs is hood days. Like most of the neighborhoods in LA, they have a day in which the whole neighborhood comes back together, right? And celebrates. It's kind of like celebrating your loved ones who have passed, but also just to see each other, right? And so for Jordan Downs, and for Grape Street, it's 10 Trade Day, because the 103rd and Grape Street is a neighborhood. So every October 3rd, thousands of people come from all across the country, and convene in Watts for our hood day. And so one day, like when we first hooked up with Jim in the late 80s, we invited Jim to our hood day. And so Jim pulls up in the projects and jumps out the car, and folks is like, whoa, Jim Brown is at our hood day. And so here we had a major, national icon.
Right.
And also inviting us up to his house and buying food and drinks and all this types of stuff and hosting our families and our mothers and having us to bring our kids and stuff up there, man. It was phenomenal, right? In terms of this partnership, that we were creating. And I think I'm probably getting away from the question.
No, that's great. I actually kind of blown away by the creativity and the efforts to create legitimacy. So justifying, instigating the talks because of the color purple, the blend of red and blue, the imagery of the cohesiveness of grapes, just incredibly creative, in a sense, increasing your power and persuasiveness through this sense of legitimacy, right? So really interesting. Now, you also painted a great picture of marching through the streets, causing quite a stir, and of dropping knowledge, as you put it, standing on the crate. Now, how did that go over? You mentioned people weren't very receptive to the idea of peace at the time. How did those talks generally go over?
We had a defining meeting at the high school one day. All of the homies was up there, and I was up there talking. My boy Playmate, who was no longer with us, had just gotten shot up with an AK. It just came home from the hospital. And so I was up there talking about, we got to stop the killing. Nobody's winning the war. And all it took was one dissenting voice, and it was him, because he was angry because he just got shot. And he was like, called me a bunch of explicit words and all kinds of stuff, and that they ain't gonna never be over with them and all of that. And so we got to going back and forth, and other people got into it and stuff and everything. And like the thing that actually dispersed the argument and conversation was the police actually showed up and we all left. But later on that evening, we got together and had a really intense conversation and dialogue and created a real partnership around it. Because we were like, hey, we're not saying that in situations where there's justification that you can't get down. But we're saying that a lot of innocent people are dying in the neighborhood, family. And some of the stuff that we're dying over is petty. If we come to the table, we can actually come to different terms and agreements. One of the big things was the colors. If you had on red or blue or purple and you just got caught in the wrong neighborhood, ain't no question in the conversation, you was getting shot. And so one big part of the peace treaty was eliminating colors as a reason to harm somebody. That was one of the big agreements that we made collectively. So after kind of like some of the informal conversations, we had very formal meetings, and we met at the Masjid al-Rasul with cats from the Nickersons and the PJs for several months, intense meetings. And then at one point, after we had all kind of like seen each other and agreed, somebody said, hey, look, we're willing to do this. Where y'all shooters at? Every neighborhood got shooters. And so they was like, I got to bring y'all shooters in here now. And so we set up a meeting. We brought the shooters in the room. And so they looked across the room. The shooters see each other. They're like, hey, y'all with it? We with it. Y'all with it? We with it. Okay. And so the initial agreement was we're not going to go in each other's neighborhoods. And that if something went down, we have people in the neighborhood who we communicate through to find out if it happened. Because here's the thing that happened, Warren, that was horrific. Law enforcement was invested in us killing each other because they justified their budget based upon this is how they got $100,000 in overtime money, right? Because of the investigations are going on around the conflicts between the neighborhoods. What would happen is that two dudes would get into it at the gambling shack at night and somebody get robbed and then say the cats from the Nickersons come through and do a drive-by in Jordan Downs. And we don't have no communication with those cats. So who was the communication? The police. And so the police would come to the neighborhood and they were like, yeah, we heard the Nickersons did it. I swear. And folks would go back to the neighborhood and shoot innocent people. And so the peace treaty created an open line of communication. And so law enforcement was no longer able to manipulate people in the middle. And if there was a conflict that happened at night between folks, we got on the phone. If there was a drive-by that happened in the neighborhood and they said that the Nickersons did it, I'm on the phone calling Kalboski and the Nickersons, or Big Donnie or Hanky, and saying, hey, man, they said that it was y'all that did the drive-by last night. They said it was a car that looked like this color, and then they'd go check and come back and be like, nah, that wasn't us. Or they'd come back and say, yeah, that was the little homies. We own it. You know what I'm saying? And with disciplined folks, it was, man.
Yeah, a real game changer, just agreeing to open up some communication channels and the impact of that, clarifying those rumors and misunderstandings before taking action.
You can imagine, the peace treaty we signed on April 28th, 1992, we designed after the Israeli-Egyptian peace accord, which was actually signed on the same day, interestingly, and by our brother, Ralph Bunch, who grew up in South LA, who grew up right down the street from us. So significant, right, in terms of all of that. But
what elements from the peace treaty did you pull from specifically?
The armistice agreement and the ceasefire. And so the agreement was that we wouldn't harm each other without a conversation and a sit down. And that, and so then we created activities, like we launched the Grassroots Sports Federation and started like having these football games. And we have some great documentaries and stuff. And it wasn't to get rid of gangs, but it was to strengthen a relationship amongst people who choose to be a part of the culture, because gangs aren't inherently negative. They're surrogate families. There's less than 3 to 5% of so-called gang members that are actually committing violent crime and murder. We reject the whole idea of, being anti-gang. You know what I'm saying? We're anti-violence, not anti-gang. And so, because gangs can coexist in neighborhoods, they were created, the farmers, the Slausons, to protect the Black community from like invading white folks, man. Like they used to attack us just for nothing. All of the sunset towns, like Compton used to be a sundown community where Black folks couldn't go. Southgate, Linwood, neighborhoods that surrounds Watts. Man, if you walked outside those neighborhoods and got caught over there late at night, man, the sheriffs would bust your head. And this was all the way up into the 70s, family, 80s, And so just so that the context in which people had to survive gave birth to the systems of protection. And then they just got manipulated later because in Watts, we had the Firestone plant. We had a bunch of huge manufacturing companies. And when all of them went out of business and moved over to seas, people who was hustling on the side to make ends meet, hustle became a full-time get down. So that they can take care of their families and support themselves. And again, all of this underscores the decay that happened, in the community that led to the high levels of violence. Because I would say that the crack cocaine trade, as I said earlier, contributed that. Because before people had money, that they were making from selling dope, I mean, somebody had a 22 shotgun, somebody had a 12 gauge, somebody had a little 38, but after the crack cocaine trade, man, people had AK-47s and MAC-10s and, and all types of stuff.
Before we get to some of your current initiatives, and to sort of just stick with the timeline a bit, the peace agreement broke down. Can you talk about why you think that happened, and then maybe any sort of lessons learned that, any takeaways you had from that whole experience?
So, peace is a series of peaks and valleys. It's not a destination. You don't arrive there and then you're there forever. As you can imagine, the day that we signed the peace treaty, somebody got shot the following day. And so we had to come up with an agreement that one monkey don't stop no show, as we said in the neighborhood. But the thing was that peace is about consistently coming back to the table to renegotiate the terms that brought us there in the first place. And so that became the open dialogue and conversation. We sustained the peace treaty for 12 years in its original form. At 10-year point, as individuals, we now had launched organizations. And so we signed a 10-year agreement at the 10th anniversary of the peace treaty, saying that now we're going to work together organizationally to build community-based public safety or community violence intervention strategies to reduce violence and crime in our neighborhood and sustain that reduction. So that was the agreement that we had 10 years in. The thing, so in terms of breakdown, every generation has a different kind of language and message. So for our generation, it was the peace treaty. That was the language. For this generation, peace treaty is not the language. Maybe it's an agreement. You know what I'm saying? Amongst, those who choose to live the lifestyle, right? And so 10 years, we had new blood, new individuals to come into the movement. And then also individuals who used to run little mom and pop shops now was having $200,000-$300,000 grants to be able to hire staff and actually now have to put systems in place, right? And have deliverables and outcomes. And that became a whole nother type of conversation. So we went from gangbanging against each other individually to still living out of the scarcity mentality and thinking that there's such a little dollars for our work in the system that we start fighting amongst each other over the city and, and state dollars to support community-based solutions, right?
Interesting.
And I would say that still exists to a greater or lesser degree because of the scarcity stuff, and because also, there just wasn't a lot of investment in community violence intervention or community-based public safety as a strategy.
Yeah. Thank you for walking us quickly through a lot that has happened in some amazing initiatives and work by yourself. And congratulations for all of that. Let's move to now. Maybe with, you explained the state in the 70s and the late 80s. Maybe you could give us your view of the situation now, and then we'll talk about some of the work you're doing.
Sure. I think that last year there were 40,000 gun-related kind of deaths in the U.S., right? A high percentage of those, are rooted in urban communities across the country in terms of they categorize it as gang violence in most cases. But we know that the thing that underscores most violence in neighborhoods is poverty and trauma that has gone unaddressed, right? And so 30 years, our work has evolved. In 2004, my good friend Ras Baraka from Newark, New Jersey, was the principal at the biggest high school in Newark. Newark had a reputation as well. They were on the top 10 most violent city list for almost 50 consecutive years. And just the violence in Newark was horrific. Also, Newark was the second city after Watts to kick off the rebellion as well. And so there's a lot of similarities, in terms of kind of community culture and, kind of advocacy and everything, right? And so Baraka called me one day and told me, hey, man, he was like, I got all these kids running around on my campus in purple. And I asked them where they was from. And they said they was from Grape Street. And so we laughing because he knows all about Grape. He's, spent a lot of time in LA with us and stuff, right? So he was like, hey, man, we got a major war going on in Newark. Grape Street is the biggest Crip gang in the city of Newark and in the state of New Jersey. Insane, brother, right? My neighborhood in Watts has now a presence in Newark, New Jersey, and in the state, right? Okay. And so Barack was like, hey, I want you to bring some of the homies out here because they don't know what you guys are doing with the peace treaty. And so we bought some of the homies, my man Warren.
When was this, Aqeela?
This was in 2004.
Okay.
When we showed up, to to Newark, to Baxter Terrace housing projects, man, we got met by 400 youth and young adults to see the big homies from the motherland, to show you the impact of this culture, right? One of the largest decentralized movements in the country, this urban street gangs, right? And it's not inherently violent as people think, so it could be transformed and used, right? So Baraka became the mayor 10 years later, 2014, and he reached out to me and tapped me to come in to build out his community-based public safety initiative, the Newark Community Street Team. So NCST, it's now one of the most successful community violence intervention strategies in the country. Thanks to the visionary leadership of Mayor Baraka. We have a three-pronged strategy: high-risk intervention, assertive outreach, and victims advocacy. When we started to work in Newark in 2014, there was 104 homicides. In the first 2 years of implementing the strategy, we had a 12% reduction in homicides in the city. In 2020, we had a 60-year low. When violence was spiking all across the country because of the pandemic, we had a couple of really significant things to happen. One, we had a 12,000 person protest because, of course, the public execution of George Floyd became a real inflection point in the country. Baraka led the 12,000 person march, engaged all of our community violence intervention partners in the march, because we saw all of the conflicts and window breaking and all of the crazy stuff from agent provocateurs coming in cities around marches. But we deployed our community violence intervention organizations and teams. We had not one arrest, not one. And then also in 2020, our officers didn't fire their revolvers, not once, right? And to me, this was because of the coordinated strategy that we put together. That every Monday morning, I was talking to the command staff, at Newark PD, also the community-based organizations, our hospital-based violence intervention program. We were all in conversation. And so phenomenal success in terms of the work, that we've done in Newark. As a direct result of now this 8 consecutive years in a row of decreases in homicide, we went from 104 to 51 that we had last year. We got we were tapped by the White House to run the nation's community violence intervention collaborative. Paid that, right? The Biden administration reached out and tapped me to design a strategy for 16 cities across the country, helping to build the capacity of their community violence intervention agencies to serve as a complementary strategy to policing in cities. Phenomenal. I had an opportunity to sit in the Rose Garden, man, me and the mayor, along with many of our community partners, to hear the president. This is unprecedented, saying that law enforcement is not the only solution to safety in our respective communities, and that we need a both-and strategy. We need investment in procedural justice training and support for cops, but we also need an investment in community violence intervention as a strategy to strengthen the role of residents, leveraging their relationship capital to prevent and intervene in conflicts in neighborhoods. And so that initiative was 16 months, produced a phenomenal amount of results. 52 organizations, community violence intervention organizations across 16 cities participated. We moved about, I would say, anywhere from like $5 to $7 million to these respective organizations. The collective helped a couple of cities, a couple of community-based organizations apply for federal dollars. The Biden administration, first in the history, of our country, passed the Safer Communities Act, put $250 million in community violence intervention. The Department of Justice administers the grant. Last year, they put out $100 million, funded 46 organizations in 22 states, and the collective applied to be the lead TTA provider, training and technical assistance provider, helping these community violence intervention organizations with implementing their community violence intervention prevention strategy in their cities, and was funded. So you're talking about racial justice and equity. Big ups to the Biden administration, because they really believe in it. They really are acting on it and are making significant investments in this work. And so we are just so fortunate that we had the opportunity to participate in that process. And now, philanthropy has come to the table. Just want to give a big shout out to the Barmer Group, to the Schusterman Foundation. They stepped up big after the White House initiative ended in December of 23, and invested $22 million in a 12-city, 5-year initiative that the collective, the National Institute of Criminal Justice Reform, the Health Alliance for Violence Intervention, Cities United, these are all Black-led agencies who are working at the intersection of public health and public safety in this community violence ecosystem. And so unprecedented investment that's coming through the federal government, that's coming through philanthropy to support a community-driven strategy that complements law enforcement. And that's not an alternative to policing. We need the cops, but a complementary strategy.
Fantastic. All of that, the numbers, the results, the funding that's coming through. Let's dig into this strategy a bit. And I want to know what works, whether prevention or intervention. What are some of the best practice that you think should be implemented across the country?
Absolutely. So the first thing I would say that we have to understand that prevention and intervention are two respective, like kind of in separate fields. You know, prevention is about young people and folks before they actually get in, they have some interaction with the criminal legal system or, violent situation. Intervention is about folks who are already engaged in violence and who have maybe had a history. And so just want to make a distinction about that, right? There's been significant investment in prevention programs, right? And after school programs and in services, but there hasn't been any investment historically in intervention, right? So best practices in terms of intervention. And so here's the thing that I would say that tells you that you have a community violence intervention strategy that is properly staffed. If your staff is from the neighborhoods in which you serve, Pookie, Raheem, and Sabrina and them, who come from the element that you're seeking to mediate and intervene, then you're on the right track. I'd say community violence intervention or, your boots on the ground, like kind of folks, is the hub of your community violence intervention strategy, right? So in cities, we go in, we do a landscape analysis in partnership with law enforcement. We identify the key hotspots. We identify the individuals and agencies who are active in those neighborhoods to try to address violence. And then we work with those individuals and agencies to develop a comprehensive plan. We assess the organizations, both fiscal and programmatic, like kind of infrastructure. We survey the staff. We look at trauma and healing services in terms of how you are supporting your staff through a workforce development model in order to implement this work. Again, most of the folks who do this work come to it with a tremendous amount of trauma that is unaddressed and high ACEs scores, adverse childhood experiences, right? And then after you survey your boots, then we develop a comprehensive TTA plan, training and technical assistance plan. We scale the organization in terms of readiness, 1 to 4. We develop action plans for the agency. And then we have broader, like long range, mid range, and short range, mid range, and long-term goals. So this becomes a living document for organizations as well as cities to be able to use to track their advancement towards safety, right? Because safety is not just the absence of violence and crime. It's also the presence of well-being in the infrastructure to support victims and survivors in their respective healing journey. So like currently, a lot of the public safety infrastructure that we have in cities are kind of antiquated because crime data says nothing about whether or not people feel safe. We have to develop a different tool to survey the most vulnerable in the community to really understand like kind of people's relationship to safety because it's subjective, right? A high-risk intervention team, people call them credible messengers. They call them, interchangeable names. People call them outreach workers. But it's important that you have a boots-on-the-ground team that is made up of folks who are engaged in, who used to be engaged in maybe some of the conflicts that exist in the neighborhood, because it's them who are going to leverage their relationships. Training is highly important. We deploy nobody in the field unless you've been trained. So all of the interventionists are certificated in many cases in terms of how they do the work in the field. I would say your second tier of interventions in your ecosystem is your hospital-based violence intervention program. It's important that you have your hospital engaged in the strategy, especially the trauma, so HVIP is a program in which the trauma staff actually is engaged in community violence intervention. The hospital has a relationship with the community violence intervention agency. In some cases, the hospital and the community violence intervention agency have staff that are embedded in a trauma unit. Right. So when Pookie gets shot and he comes to the hospital, people that he knows goes bedside and consent him to participate in the program. Once he's well enough to be furloughed out, because in most cases, they're going right back into the environment where they were shot at. We need to connect them with our high-risk interventionists, develop a safety plan so that we might need to emergency relocate that individual if we can't kind of mediate the conflict before they come home. There's a really high threshold for arrest and prosecution, right? And so law enforcement, while they're gathering their information to make an arrest, the high-risk intervention team that's made up of Pookie, Raheem, and Sabrina and them is leveraging their relationships in the neighborhood and talking to the folks saying, hey, we know that such and such was out of line. That's probably why y'all shot him or whatever it is, right? Give us an opportunity to try to mediate this situation, and not take them down all the way. Another core strategy is our trauma recovery center. Trauma underscores all of the violence in the neighborhood. it is extremely difficult to offer it as a service to most Black and brown folks because we have a history of experimentation on us through the medical establishment. And so when you say mental health services, people are going the other way because you get misdiagnosed in most cases. And now, there's a lot of things that you get disqualified from. And so trauma underscores all of the violence that's happening in the neighborhood. And so we had to reframe this idea of mental health services. We call it wellness services. And, local therapists from the neighborhood. We have a national model, the Alliance for Trauma Recovery Centers, that was created by Dr. Alicia Basilari out of California. And it's 16 free sessions of therapeutic support by local therapists who live in your neighborhood. And been phenomenal, because for a person to be able to kind of self-diagnose, I remember the head of our high-risk intervention team. I mean, this cat has experienced a lot of trauma. I mean, jail time, had been shot people, and all that type of stuff, right? Which made him, really credible, being able to facilitate things in the community. So we partnered with an organization called EJUSA that programs an initiative called Trauma to Trust. And this is an initiative that is done between community and law enforcement to strengthen the relationship. So they unpack personal traumas and historic traumas collectively, and it's been phenomenal. I mean, it's really contributed to the reform at the Newark Police Department in the city, and so I remember Byron coming home to me one day. I mean, coming to me one day and told me, brother, he said, I finally know what I got. I was like, what do you mean? He said, I got vicarious trauma. Man, I was dying laughing. But you know what? It was profound for him.
Bang on, yeah.
To be able to self-diagnose and say, hey, now I'm going to engage into some activities to start addressing this hypervigilance that I experience, when I'm in certain places. And so I would say that those technologies, boots on the ground, a community violence intervention strategy in which you hire the local folks in the neighborhood, credible messengers to do this work. It's important that you hire the right people. Hospital-based violence intervention, trauma recovery, safe passage. Safe passage is critical in terms of this work. We did a study with the city of Newark and the health department and discovered that most of the conflicts that were happening in the city started out on middle school and high school campuses. One of the big conflicts, that we mediated in Newark, it was a 10-year war in which these dudes traded over a dozen bodies between them, was over a young lady, at Westside High School. But after the first body drops, nobody remembers, what I'm saying, what it was about, right? And so we do an initiative called Safe Passage. We started at 4 schools. We're now at 22 in the city of Newark. We basically make sure our kids go to school safely and come home. And so we mitigate all of the stuff in between. You see a kid don't have uniform, we buy them uniforms. We see a kid that don't have a haircut, we get you a haircut. We see a kid that ain't got no backpack and got no belt for their pants, we get it. You ain't got no money to go to the prom, we're gonna get you some money to go to the prom. Some kids is bullying you from the neighborhood. Oh man, we're gonna call Big Raheem, from the block and ask him to show up, because our folks that do safe passage are credible messengers to mediate, to say, hey, man, they're messing with a little John. Can you give the word? And in some cases, we even, at the request of parents, our team would walk kids to school and home. I mean, the turnaround in the South Ward used to be one of the most violent parts of the city. I think that last year, if I'm not mistaken, you probably would have checked this. I don't think we had any shootings last year, any homicides last year in the South Ward. And this is the Public Safety Roundtable. It's a policy forum that was created by NCST to engage residents in the public safety process. As I said, you say public safety and people say police. We don't really understand, the public doesn't understand its role in public safety because so much of our power has been abdicated to law enforcement. And law enforcement feel like they own safety, right? And so it's been a challenge, kind of back and forth. The Public Safety Roundtable in the city of Newark has become the forum for those dialogues to happen. We meet every other week. And it's not a polite conversation because, man, sometimes, the residents, and it's over 100 folks now that participate. We started out with 7 people in the basement and now there's over 100 every other week, right? And man, it's, we dig into the cops when they do the wrong thing, and we celebrate them when they do the right thing. They do the same for us. They're like, hey, listen, man, y'all said that y'all got that thing together over on Avon. They're like, hey, we don't see it. And I'm like, yeah, hold us accountable. I'm like, and so now we got to go and get on top of it, right? And so it's been a really phenomenal partnership between the community and law enforcement, over the past few years. And again, it's a constantly work in progress. But the dialogue that we have now has been just foundational to the success of reducing violence and crime in the city of Newark.
Yeah. So again, the power of opening up the communication channels, just like the impact it had by the original peace treaty, here now between law enforcement and the community. Right. So it sounds like an incredibly comprehensive, multi-pronged strategy with practical tactics and cohesive too, like getting the hospitals on board. That's really great. Let's move to the future then. In terms of preventing or intervening with community violence, what do you see as the biggest challenges or opportunities even going forward?
Two things. I would say this is a challenge and an opportunity. The Biden administration, unlike any other administration in the history of this country, has committed to investing in community violence intervention as a complementary strategy to policing, right? Rounding out, our public safety ecosystem. Through the Safer Communities Act, already moved $250 million through DOJ to support this work. In the Safer Americas Act, they have about $5.2 billion, slated to go to community-based organizations and agencies to balance our public safety ecosystem. Huge opportunity, right? Unprecedented. The challenge is, does the movement, community violence intervention agencies, have the capacity to absorb the investment? Currently, no. Like most of our community-based organizations don't have like kind of fiscal infrastructure, to be able to absorb the dollars. And I'm talking about like kind of business essentials or nonprofit essentials, having 501c3s, bank accounts, licensing, insurances, all of those different types of things, right? Because in the past, the dollars, like you can't utilize federal, city, state dollars to support those kind of pieces. And so philanthropy has stepped up, as of late, and they're playing a very strategic role with government in terms of seeding and incubating like kind of innovation that's happening in the field, with the goal of philanthropy. I mean, not philanthropy, but public dollars in the federal government, states and cities being able to come in and provide long-term sustainable dollars, right? And so it's a challenge and an opportunity for the movement. Now, just in terms of the future of this work, hey, Warren, we're going to shift the public safety narrative in this country forever, because he or she who controls the narrative controls the game. And forever, law enforcement has owned this narrative around safety. Again, you say public safety and people say police, but we're moving away from that to a shared safety model and to a shared safety strategy, because it is beneficial to law enforcement. Cops just want to go home. You know what I'm saying? To their families. They sacrifice so much of themselves, right, in terms of this work. And it's difficult, to be a cop, man, like, especially now. You put on that uniform and you inherit all of the shit, use my language, of every mistake or a crime that has been committed against the public, with cops, And so one of the things that we advocate for cops for, we're like, hey, we want them to get more therapeutic services and healing services and recovery services. And it needs to be public, because we want them to show up fully rooted in their humanity. You know what I'm saying? So that they're not coming from situations where they have tough things that are happening at home, or they're being totally underpaid and overworked, and something that somebody say in the public can trigger them, you know what I'm saying, to throw their whole career away, and also the collateral impact that it has on community, right? And so I think that our collective work is shifting the narrative in this country around safety forever. And so I think that, what we're going to see happen in the next few years is a greater investment in community-based solutions. I think that we're going to see law enforcement, more police departments become more sophisticated. I think that we need to shrink police departments. The data says that 38 to 40% of 911 calls are for non-serious, non-violent, acts. And so we need to pull our cops out of responding to those type of situations and empower residents to deal with those situations. The data also says that 2% of the population is producing 80 to 90% of the harm in any respective community. So we have to start utilizing data to be able to identify that small population of individuals and provide comprehensive wraparound services and support to that population. And we need to do this in partnership with law enforcement. It's hard for them traditionally to be able to share intel because, their intelligence is, the information that they have internally is their bread and butter. And so we're like, hey, if you arrest a kid, and it's a repeat arrest, for stealing the car, send them to us. You know what I'm saying? So that we can look at the holistic situation and then we can actually report back to you on that, right? And so we have to create a comprehensive strategy around safety. And I think that we're well, on our way to do it.
Wonderful. Anything I haven't asked you that you'd like to speak to or want to mention where people can find you and learn more about your initiatives?
Yes, sir. So I would say that you can find us two sites. You can find us at www. Newark Community Street Team. That's our boots on the ground strategy, comprehensive. Please come out and visit us to see the phenomenal work that folks are doing. You could also go to the Newark Community Street Team's Facebook page. Every public safety roundtable since the inception is located there. Right. And so you can actually watch it, you can actually watch them and then join, one of the roundtables in the future. The Community-Based Public Safety Collective, www.cbpscollective.org. The collective is the nation's first Black-led CVI-PI Community Violence Intervention Prevention Initiative TTA provider. We are doing comprehensive strategies all across the country in terms of the work. We produced a couple of groundbreaking reports. One, Redefining Public Safety in America, that brought together about 20 key thought leaders around community violence intervention and produced a document that's also on our site. In addition, we did a document on national standards and practices because we knew that a lot of cities would be thinking about how do we develop, a comprehensive community violence intervention strategy. So we produced a document on standards and practices as a guide, for cities as they're thinking through this process. That's also available on our site.
Excellent. I'll put links up to both those initiatives. Aqeela, thank you so much. It's an incredible journey that you've condensed here for us today and sharing your expertise and knowledge. I wish you continued success with your important work here. So thanks again.
Warren, appreciate you.
Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more from international experts digging into a range of topics on conflict, power, and persuasion, subscribe to your favorite podcast app or visit us at cian.org. That's CIIAN.org.